And now we're all set to go. All right, everybody can hear me, everybody can see me. All right, good. All right, I know there are a couple of people who are traveling this week who would normally be here with us. I think there were 3 or 4 people who would normally be with us. So we would actually have been about 16 out of our 20 screens at the end. That's pretty good. I want to talk tonight about what I'm calling this lecture the Hasmonean Miracle. Now, I thought about it long and hard. I could have said the Hanukkah miracle, but Hanukkah is an invention that comes later on. Hanukkah is not the story I want to tell you tonight, although I'll refer to that story. I could call it the Maccabean miracle, because the people who fought these battles against the Seleucid Empire, the Greek Syrian Empire, they were called, according to tradition, the Maccabees. The word Maccabees, we're not sure where it comes from. It may have come from the Hebrew word makevet, which means hammer, because according to tradition, the Maccabees were a kind of a guerrilla force that managed to defeat much stronger enemies by fighting not conventional warfare, not out in the open field, that would strike the enemy where they were most vulnerable. It was kind of like the American Revolution. Those of you who know about the American Revolution, the British were used to fighting wars by coming at you straight on. If you ever studied the Revolutionary War and the Battle of Bunker Hill, you know, the British came up against the American forces on Bunker Hill in Boston. They came up straight rows, file after file. And the Americans really decimated a lot of British in that battle. The British ultimately took Bunker Hill, but at a tremendous cost. And that's because the Americans didn't fight in the conventional way. We fought what would be called guerrilla warfare, behind fences, behind the areas that we knew. We knew the land, we knew the terrain. So why were we successful against a much bigger army, a bigger enemy, a more well-equipped enemy? The reason we were successful is we fought unconventionally. Because we knew the area, and the British didn't know it as well, we were able to take advantage of the topography, the land, the conditions that we fought under, and fighting our style of battle, we were able to defeat an enemy eventually much larger than we were. Well, the Maccabees fought in the same way. Maccabee could refer to the fact that they struck hammer-like blows, really strong. They didn't hit the enemy full on. They didn't march at them full frontal. They struck them in vulnerable spaces. They ambushed them at various spots. They employed all kinds of ruses and strategic devices, and they managed to defeat an enemy that was much larger and much better equipped than they were. But the word Maccabee, there's some question as to whether they were really called the Maccabees. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. Everybody agrees, though, that the name of the dynasty that this family founded after they were successful in defeating the Syrian Greeks, they called the dynasty the Hasmonean dynasty. So in our lecture this evening, in our discussion this evening, I'm going to refer to it not as the miracle of the Maccabees. I'm going to refer to it as the Hasmonean miracle, the miracle of how a small family, which became the founders of a dynasty called the Hasmonean dynasty, how a small family called the Hasmoneans managed to do the unthinkable. They managed to defeat an enemy which by all rights should have utterly destroyed them. The Assyrian Empire, the Seleucid Empire, was much, much larger, much better equipped, and much better trained and armed than the Hasmoneans. The Jews did not have the advantage here, whereas in 1948, we could say that the Jews were successful in the wars following the establishment of the State of Israel because they were unified and had developed strategic training in defense and in warfare. The truth is that the Maccabees couldn't stand up to the Hasmoneans. So the question is, how did they last? How did a small group of untrained fighters, relatively unequipped, manage to defeat what was then a major power in the Middle East, the Seleucid Empire? Well, that is a story we're going to tell tonight. And as I have said, we commemorate this miracle yearly, we Jewish people, in our celebration of the holiday of Hanukkah. So if you've ever sat at a Hanukkah party or something and someone has decided to tell you the story of Hanukkah, you have probably heard one version or another of this Maccabean or this Hasmonean struggle. If you have not, however, I'm going to tell you the story without some of the distortion, without some of the fancy additions that were made. This story comes to us basically from two different sources. If you want to know, where did the story of the Hasmonean battles, where does the story of the victory of Hanukkah come from? It basically comes from two sources. We will explore both sources tonight. You'll have a chance to see them. And then after our session tonight, I will send out the written versions of both sources. One source, the earliest source, is from a series of biblical books, which is not really part of the Bible. I say biblical books because it goes back to the time of the Bible, but these books were never contained in the Hebrew Bible. I've already told you the Hebrew Bible consists of 24 books, the Torah, prophets, Ketuvim. But in addition to the 24 official books of the Hebrew Bible, there were a group of books that were not included in the Hebrew Bible, that were authentic books, that were recorded at the time the events occurred, but for one reason or another were not included among the canonical texts of the Hebrew Bible. 4 of those books, which form our earliest, almost contemporary literary sources for the holiday of Hanukkah, is what we call the books of Maccabees. And traditionally, there are 4 books of Maccabees. I've heard some say there's 5. Basically, there are Maccabees 1, Maccabees 2, Maccabees 3, and Maccabees 4. And each of the 4 versions of the Maccabees covers with a different aspect of the history of the holiday. But the one that we are going to refer to tonight, the one that has the best historical account, is the book of First Maccabees. So our earliest source comes from the book of Maccabees, which is not part of the Hebrew Bible. It's part of the Apocrypha. It wasn't included in the Bible. And it tells us the origins, almost contemporary version of the events that occurred in the time of the Hasmoneans. The second source that we have is better known to all of you. You will all probably recognize the second source, because the second source is the source that tells you about the menorah the candelabra that was found in the temple, and there was not enough oil to light it, and miraculously lasted for 8 days. That story is not a contemporaneous story. That story did not come about the time of the actual events of the Hasmonean revolt. That story, the story of the cruse of oil and burning for 8 days, that doesn't come until about 4 or 5 centuries later, okay? So the difference between the two sources we're going to study tonight is amazing. The first story is almost written at the time of the Maccabean struggle, about the year 165, 66 BCE. The second story, you do not find that until the Talmud. The Talmud was finally redacted and finished in the year 500 CE. So even if the story was there earlier, you're talking about a period of 4 or 5 centuries. Let us see what we know about these two sources. And before I do, let me remind you where we came from last time. I told you, and I'm not going to repeat it again, so don't worry, I'm not going back to all of last lesson. I told you that after the Jewish people had been defeated by the Babylonians and their temple destroyed, they were next conquered for a period of a couple hundred years by a kingdom known as Persia, the Persian Empire, from about 539 till the next 200 years. Israel was under the authority of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire, and this is very quick, fell in the year approximately 331 to an empire from the west called the Greek or Macedonian Empire. That was the empire of Alexander the Great. We sometimes refer to it as the Hellenistic period. And from the year 324 until the year 165, we were under the influence, the Jewish people who lived in Palestine were under the influence of the Hellenistic Empire. Now, I already told you from previous times, so I'm not going to repeat it too much, except to say that that period of time that we were under the rule of the Hellenistic kingdoms was roughly a period from about 301 BCE to about the year 165 BC. That was about the time we were under the rule of the Hellenists. After Alexander died and after the wars among his various generals as to who is going to control the area, the first empire that controlled, the first Hellenistic empire that controlled the land of Palestine was the Ptolemaic Empire from Egypt. And they ruled from 301 to about 200 BCE. So for about a period of 100 years, the land of Palestine was ruled by the Ptolemies in Egypt. About the year 200, the Ptolemies lost their territories in Palestine. They lost it to the kingdom to the north of Palestine called the Seleucid Empire or the Assyrian Empire. And in about the year 200, Israel fell under the authority of the Seleucid Empire. It only is destined to remain part of the Seleucid Empire for a period of less than 50 years, because the Seleucids will succeed in losing the country very, very quickly. So that is the historic background. Now, let me remind you what conditions were like just before the Maccabean revolt occurs. First of all, where the Ptolemaic Empire had been relatively stable and lasted for 100 years with very little change, with great stability, the Seleucid Empire, which followed, was marked by a great number of political and financial crises, one right after another. The Ptolemaic Empire was strong and certain and set for 100 years. Until they lost the empire, Jewish life in Palestine under the Ptolemies was governed by the Jewish people themselves. They had to recognize and pay tribute to the authorities in Egypt, but basically Jewish life went on as it had in the Persian period. What happens in the year approximately 200 CE is that the kingdom, the area of Palestine, the land of Palestine, passes from under the authority of the Egyptian Ptolemaic Empire. It passes to the Seleucid Empire, and the Seleucid Empire was very unstable. Okay, if the Ptolemaic Empire was strong and stable and relatively long reigns of the kings, the empire of the Seleucids in Syria was all broken up and had all kinds of problems. First of all, the Seleucids ruled over everything from Phoenicia and Palestine and Syria all the way heading eastward toward the area of Iran. So the Seleucid Empire was far larger, far more diverse, far less unified than was the Ptolemaic Empire, which resulted in two kinds of problems. Number one was the problem of financial stability. Because the Seleucids had to keep control over a much wider empire, which meant sending their armies great distances and having to maintain a lot of armies, because the Seleucids had forces all throughout the kingdoms, the lands, the territories that they had conquered, the Ptolemies didn't have to worry about that. The Ptolemies were all concentrated in Egypt. So the Seleucids had a great empire to rule, a lot of different countries, a lot of different people, a lot of different customs, a lot of different religions, which meant that they had to send out armies and troops all the way throughout the area of the Middle East. And not only that, not only did they have to bear the expense of greater armies, but unlike the Ptolemaic system, the Seleucids ran into financial difficulties. Basically, they not only couldn't they support themselves financially, they were forced to raid the treasuries of the people around them. So from the year 200 until about the year 165, when the rebellion occurs, the Seleucids were a very unpopular empire. Why? Because in order to support themselves financially, they had to send their troops, their mercenaries, their governors and whatnot. They had to send them out, and they had to collect tremendous amounts of taxes and other kinds of financial burdens. They had to collect these kinds of monies from all over their empire. Now, you can imagine that when you have an empire as big as the Seleucid Empire, and you have as many troops as they had, the cost of maintaining troops and sending out forces and supplying troops for these long periods of time was astronomical. Not to mention the fact that the Seleucids had suffered an early defeat against Rome, and they were paying tribute to Rome. So number one, the Seleucids were broke or close to broke, and the only way they could support themselves was by imposing large financial burdens upon all of the kingdoms, not just the Jews, all of the kingdoms over whom they ruled. What that meant was that they were never very popular among the native populations. If you think taxes weren't popular in colonial America, you can only imagine what it was like to try and collect taxes in the Seleucid Empire. People were no more likely or more willing or more happy about paying taxes then than they are now. And because the taxes, the financial burdens were so heavy because of the needs of the Seleucid Empire, the demands that they made upon country after country, land after land, region after region, kingdom after kingdom, were so severe that the people in these various communities were on the verge of revolt anyway, because they were being taxed they were being taxed heavily. They were not happy. They were not happy with the system. They may have ended up paying, but they didn't do so willingly. That was one problem. The Seleucid Empire financially lost itself a kingdom by overtaxing and overburdening it. But there was another problem with the Seleucid Empire, and I've said this before too, and then I go on. They were much more diverse. How do you keep control of an empire that extends all the way from Palestine and Phoenicia, Lebanon, what we call today, and Syria and Jordan and all over the Middle East? How do you keep them unified when every country had their own laws, their own traditions, their own customs, and their own religions? Well, the Seleucids said, if the only way, we got to figure out a way of keeping these people together. It's no good they have a lot of separate kingdoms. So they said, here's an idea. We're going to create one law, one series of laws for all of our different kingdoms. We're going to try and unify our great empire by creating one set of laws that all of our people can follow. Well, that law was based upon Hellenistic tradition. It was based upon Greek law. The only problem was that where most other religions and most other peoples in the Near East were agreeable to adding to their own religions a belief or a commitment to the religion of the empire itself, the Jews were not willing to do that. Unlike other nations, the Jews were not willing to accept the laws of the Hellenistic world upon themselves. And so, as you might imagine, what happens is that when Antiochus decides to impose these laws on the Jewish people, when he decides to make it not voluntary, but compulsory, and compulsory with the force of severe punishment that they were violated, you can only imagine the anger and the resentment and the seething revolt that was brewing up among the Jewish people. Not only were the Jewish people being taxed heavily, they were also being compelled now to follow laws that were contrary to their religion. And because Judaism was at that time in history one of the few monotheistic religions of the world, which meant that we didn't go along with other religions. We didn't say, all right, we'll offer up offerings to your gods and we'll also keep our religion. Judaism said no. Judaism said we're an exclusive religion. There's only one religion that has truth in the ancient world, and that is the law of the Torah. The God of Israel is the only God of Israel. And therefore, there are no other gods, and there is no other law that is binding. You can imagine how popular the Jewish people were in the world. They denigrated everybody else's religion. They suggested that everybody else was falsely worshiping gods that weren't really gods, and that the only valid God, according to the Jewish people, was the God of Israel. So when the Jewish people were faced with this quandary of having to accept foreign religion upon themselves, they were not likely to go ahead quietly and do that. And that is what gave rise to the events that led to the revolt. Now, I told you that there are two sources for the story. I'm going to read both sources to you. I'm going to start with the one you're more familiar with, the later one. Then I'll go back to the original one, okay? So I'm going to share with you here. I'm going to hit share. Okay, hold on. Okay, I think I found it this one. Maybe share. Okay, I'm going to wait for just a moment until I make sure that everybody has. Okay, everybody sees the text. Okay, it's not a very long reading. Normally, my wife would beat me up if I were to attempt to read this on a normal occasion. But since you can read it right along with me, and it's not very long, this is the account that comes from the Talmud. Remember, this account is not written at the time of the events that it describes. It is written about 4 or 5 centuries later. And the Talmud, in a tractate called Shabbat, asks an interesting question. The Talmud starts with a question, you see it at the top of the page, what is Hanukkah? Now, can you imagine a group of rabbis asking the question, what is Hanukkah? You would say, what do you mean, what is Hanukkah? You're rabbis, you know what Hanukkah is. The truth of the matter was they had to ask that question because already by rabbinic times, it wasn't clear why we were celebrating the holiday of Hanukkah. So when they said, what is Hanukkah? It was a serious question. What is this holiday called Hanukkah? And why do we have to know about it? So here is what it says. I'm going to read with you the text. What is Hanukkah? On the 25th day of the month of Kislev, the days of Hanukkah numbered 8. So the first reference, on the 25th of Kislev begins the 8 days of Hanukkah. And then we are told one may not eulogize on them and one may not fast on them, which means that you're not allowed to be sad on Hanukkah. On certain Jewish holidays, you are forbidden to fast. You are forbidden to deliver eulogies. In other words, they are to be days of celebration. So what this tells us is that Hanukkah was celebrated for 8 days, beginning on the 25th day of Kislev, and that on the days of Hanukkah, we are forbidden to fast, and we are also forbidden to hold funerals with eulogies. And then the Talmud asks a very interesting question. What is the reason? Meaning, what is the reason we celebrate Hanukkah? And then he gives the following answer. What is the reason? When the Greeks entered the sanctuary and defiled all the oils that were in the sanctuary by touching them, when the Hasmonean Miracle overcame them and emerged victorious over them, they searched and found only one cruse, one jar, one bottle of oil that was placed with the seal of the high priest, which meant it was undisturbed by the Assyrian Greeks. And there was sufficient oil in this cruse to last to light the candelabra for only 1 day. A miracle occurred, and they lit the candelabra from this cruse of oil for 8 days. The following year, the sages instituted that those days be made holidays with the recitation of Hallel and special thanksgiving and prayer and blessing. So every year since that first miracle occurred, the sages, according to this, decreed that we observe Hanukkah to celebrate the miracle of the story, which according to the rabbis in the Talmud, the miracle was the cruse of oil. They didn't talk about the battle. They didn't talk about the long odds the Jewish people were facing. They didn't talk about the persecution. They didn't mention any of that. Their only mention of Hanukkah in the Talmud is, why do we celebrate Hanukkah? Because when we were persecuted by the Seleucid Empire, when we were persecuted by the Assyrian Greeks, when our leaders, our victorious leaders of battle, finally took back the temple and they wanted to purify it, they found only one jar of pure oil to light the menorah, and miracle of miracles, what should have lasted only 1 day at most, lasted for the 8 days it took to procure new oil. Okay, let me stop there and let me go out of here. I'll come back to it in a second. Okay. Stop sharing. Okay, how many of you are familiar with that story? Okay, the story, all right? This is the story we tell school children. This is the story we tell our congregations year after year after year. I'm not going to be a skeptic, but I'm going to tell you that is probably not the real story of Hanukkah. First of all, it may be that a miracle occurred. Far be it from me to deny miracles. It may be that they found one small cruse of oil, only enough oil to burn for 1 day. And miraculously, after they had cleansed and rededicated the temple, this oil lasted for 8 days. And because of this miracle of the oil that burnt and burned and didn't go out, that is why we celebrate Hanukkah. If you want to believe that that is the origin and that is the reason for the Hanukkah miracle, sei gesund, go in good health, okay? It's probably not. Go ahead, Lori.
But Ben, like all the holidays are 8 days. And so it just seems like a coincidence that they made Hanukkah 8 because all the other holidays are 8.
Okay, so let me address Lori's point, Lori's saying, well, what's so unusual about 8 days? All the holidays are 8 days. First of all, Lori, let me tell you that's not true, because in Israel, and outside of, in Israel, where the holidays were established, you know how long Passover was called for, how long Passover lasted? 7 days. You know how long the holiday of Shavuot lasted? one day. You know how long the holiday of Sukkot lasted? 7 days. Okay. No holidays were 8 days. The first holiday that was established as an 8-day holiday, Lori, was Hanukkah. It is not true that all the other holidays were 8 days. It is true that the major holidays of Passover and Sukkot were 7 days, but there was no 8-day holiday in Jewish tradition. The 8-day holiday is unique to the holiday of Hanukkah. Okay, so that's number one. So, all right, so 8 days, first of all.
Yeah.
Let's try and get our minds around it. What's unusual about Hanukkah that is not true about any of the other festivals or holidays of the year? Lori mentioned days. The day is not the same. Passover, 7 days. Shavuot, 1 day. Sukkot, 7 days. What else is different between Hanukkah and the other Jewish holidays? Hanukkah is not mentioned in the Bible. Look anywhere you want, you will not find it in the Bible because it doesn't exist in the Bible, because the first mention of it was in the book of Maccabees, and that isn't even in the Bible. So unlike all of the other holidays that are mentioned in the Torah, the holiday of Hanukkah is not found in the Torah at all. You cannot find any reference whatsoever to the holiday in the Torah. Craig, go ahead.
No, I'm not I don't want to come across a non-believer. I'm not, but the question that I've always wondered is, why Hanukkah? I mean, I'm sure that there's several other things that happened and I don't know them just talking to you. But I'm sure there's a whole host of different things that we can celebrate that says this was a big deal for one reason or another.
Okay.
So the question is, why Hanukkah?
All right. And by the end of tonight's session, Craig, I'm going to call upon you to answer your own question, okay? We will come, by the time we finish this, you will be able to answer your own question. Why Hanukkah? And really, that's the question that the Talmud was saying. When it says, what is Hanukkah? They were saying, why Hanukkah? What is this Hanukkah? We don't know Hanukkah from the Bible. God never told the Jewish people to observe Hanukkah. Hanukkah isn't mentioned in any of our sacred texts. Why are we making this big deal about Hanukkah? They're asking Craig the same question that you're asking. What's all of the business about Hanukkah? Why is this so played up? Oh, well, you'll see in a second. The other difference between Hanukkah and the other festivals mentioned in the Torah is that Hanukkah is not a real Jewish holiday. Okay, I'm going to say that. Well, no, let me say it is not a biblical holiday. On biblical holidays, you are not allowed to do any kind of work. The first day and the last day of a biblical holiday is like Shabbat. You are not allowed to do any kind of work on the holiday. And when I say any kind of work, it's mostly like Shabbat. The work restrictions are so severe that if you were observing Passover or Shavuot or Sukkot, those days that you observe them would be biblical holidays, which means a lot of the restrictions that things you can't do on a biblical holiday, you can't do on them. On Hanukkah, it is not a biblical, it is not a religious festival. It is not a biblical holiday. You can go to work on Hanukkah. By the way, try and tell your employees next year, or this coming December, say, Rabbi House, my rabbi said you can take off on Hanukkah and you're not supposed to go into work. And all your employers will laugh at you and say that's very, very funny. And they'll know that that's not true, because not only do you have to not work on the first day of Hanukkah, the last day of Hanukkah, you can work on every day of Hanukkah. You can go to work, you can pursue your profession, you can go to school, you can do everything you would normally do on any other day of the year. The only difference on Hanukkah is you're not allowed to be sad, you're not allowed to do eulogies or to fast. You're supposed to be happy, and on every night of the holidays, you're supposed to light the Chanukiah, the Hanukkah menorah. But you can do that when you get home. If you've worked all day and you get home at 6:30 at night, once it gets dark, you can light the Hanukkah menorah. That's it. You celebrated the holiday. If you want to play with the dreidel, it's up to you. If you want to eat potato pancakes, up to you. That's all up to you. But Hanukkah, unlike the other Jewish holidays, is not what we call a major Jewish holiday. It is a minor Jewish holiday. Okay, that's another difference. Okay. Was that Mark, is your hand up? Oh, no, okay. Okay. So Hanukkah is different. It is different. It's not biblical. The rabbis, it wasn't ordained by God. It was established much later, and it wasn't even a full holiday. So the question is, why such a big deal? Why do we make it a big deal? And more importantly, why is Hanukkah such a big deal among Jews in today's day and age? This I can answer for you very quickly. The only reason Hanukkah is a big deal in modern America, I'll explain it in one word: Christmas. Okay, that's the answer. I mean, I'm not kidding you. I'm not being facetious. That's the answer. The answer is that the only reason Hanukkah is celebrated today to the extent that it is in Jewish homes in America is Christmas. If it did not share a seasonal proximity with the holiday of Christmas, chances are Hanukkah would not be very well observed at all. As a matter of fact, when I was a boy, this was Hanukkah. We didn't even get 8 presents. When I was that kid in the old days when we had to walk miles to get to school uphill both ways. In my days, on Hanukkah, each night you came home, your parents lit the menorah. You didn't get a present every night. Maybe you got some pennies or some Hanukkah gelt to play the dreidel with. That was it. That was it. No big deal. We sang Hanukkah songs. We ate potato pancakes. That was Hanukkah. But because it occurs very close to a big Christian holiday in the same month or around the same time, the month of December, therefore, in order that Jewish children would not feel deprived or left out because they were not able to celebrate the holiday of Christmas, the Jewish community at a certain point, and I can even tell you when it occurred, it was in the later 1950s, decided to turn Hanukkah into something it never was. It tried to turn it into a rival Christmas, okay? And I'm telling you what any rabbi will tell you. Believe me, there were no Hanukkah bushes in those days, even in there were no Uncle Mattathias to take the place of Father Christmas. There was none of that stuff. But Jewish families did try and turn what was a small, special, minor Jewish holiday into a major event. Why? Because it gave Jewish kids the feeling that they weren't left out of being able to celebrate a holiday during the Christmas season. They could always tell their friends, yeah, well, you may get to wake up on Christmas morning and discover all those presents under the tree. Well, we have 8 nights of Hanukkah and our parents buy us 1 present every night. So we get to have 8 different presents over the course of the 8 days of Hanukkah. And so we get just as many presents as spread out. That was never the tradition, okay? Now, later on, all kinds of other things happened. There were no blue and white lights, by the way, just for those of you who think that blue and white lights are an ancient tradition, that long ago when Christmas lights were put up on trees and on houses, the Jews had lights on. No, that's not true. We didn't have trees, first of all, and we didn't put blue and white lights up on houses. That comes much, much later. And the reason that it also comes up is because of Christmas, because imagine being the only house on your block that doesn't have lights on. It's the pressure you're going to be under. Every single house, it's almost as bad now on Halloween. Every single house is decorated and has holiday lights, and everything is so beautiful and joyful and cheery and wonderful season, the melodies. And sure enough, there's that couple, 1 Jewish house, 2 Jewish houses maybe on a block that's standing there without lights, without decorations, that isn't having anything special. There's a great deal of pressure on Jewish families, even if they really don't celebrate Christmas, to try and do something for Hanukkah, if not for their own families, then to keep up with the Joneses on either side of them, okay? So the truth is, there was none of that. There was no Hanukkah lights and whatnot. Hanukkah basically was just a day when you went home. I take it back. There were lights, but there weren't blue and white lights. There were the lights on your menorah. You took your menorah, you went to the window, you put the menorah in the window facing the public, you lit the menorah so that everybody who passed by the house, now, aha, that's a Jewish house. That's a Jewish house. I don't even have to go up to the front door and look at the mezuzah. I look in the window, I see that there's lights burning in the window. That's a Jewish house, okay? So long before there were Christmas lights inside, there were Hanukkah lights that were burning publicly in the public thoroughfare outside of windows in the Jewish community. Hanukkah lights precede Christmas lights. And the truth is, yes, we do sing Hanukkah songs, but we don't go house to house and sing carols with carolers. We sing it in the house. We sing Hanukkah songs in the house, those of us who still remember the songs and know how to sing them. So if that is the case, And if Hanukkah only became what it was because it shares a seasonal proximity to the holiday of Christmas, and if it had not been for that fact, would probably never have been celebrated at all. I'll make one more statement, this one. You can tell how important the Jewish holiday is by how much you have to do. Shabbat, for example, very, very important. You can't light lights on Shabbos. You can't turn on lights. You can't cook food. You can't do this. To observe Shabbos the way you're supposed to observe it is very, very difficult. There are tons of laws. To observe Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or Passover or Shavuot or Sukkot, you got to build buildings. You got to create things. You got to do a lot of things. It requires a lot of work. You got to spend a lot of money. All you have to do for the holiday of Hanukkah is go home at night, light a candle, light a menorah for 8 days, maybe sing some songs. That's it. So imagine Jewish parents who slowly over time are becoming less and less knowledgeable about Judaism. This is the perfect holiday for us. First of all, it's kid friendly. It's a holiday we can give our kids during the holiday of Christmas so they don't feel left out. Number two, it's a holiday that's easy to do. We light the menorah. The most we have to learn are 3 blessings. The blessing for lighting the menorah, the blessing for the miracles, and the blessing to Shechianu. So the most Hebrew you have are 3 verses. 3 verses, that's easy. And then if you want to do Hanukkah songs, you can do them in English. It was relatively easy for Jewish families, Jewish parents, to celebrate the holiday of Hanukkah because it didn't demand too much of you. If you wanted to put up decorations, fine, put up decorations, but you didn't have to. If you wanted to put up blue and white lights, which you weren't supposed to, fine, go ahead and do it. But Hanukkah was very, very simple. So the question of why it was observed is, number one, it was child friendly. Number two, it provided an alternative to Christmas. And number three, it was easy for parents to do. It didn't require a lot of time, didn't require a lot of training, and they could give their children a version of Judaism light, which was easy to do. However, as much as I am telling you that Hanukkah was not a major holiday, it was a minor holiday, to answer Craig's question, why the big deal about Hanukkah, you have to see the second reading I'm going to share with you. Everybody ready for the second reading? This one comes from the book of Maccabees. Okay, let me find it for you here. Share. Randy, where is the second reading?
Open this.
Okay, I'll open it.
And it's on the other side of that. Just open that.
Okay, hold on 1 second, everybody. Share. Okay.
Okay. Go to the top.
Top.
At the very top, the left one.
Left one.
Very top.
Yes.
You look.
There we go. All right. Thank you, everybody. You would think after all these sessions, I would be more of a maven about how to operate these things. But truth is, if my wife wasn't here, this whole thing would go down in a flaming mess. Okay, here we go. This comes from the first book of Maccabees. Okay. It is not long because it's only about 16 or 17 verses. It's well spread out, but let me read to you. This comes from the first book of Maccabees. It comes from the point where Antiochus starts his persecutions. And the king wrote to his whole kingdom that they should be one people, that everybody should be one people. Like I told you, Antiochus had decided that in order to unify his empire, all people were going to have one set of customs, one set of rules, so that there should be one people and that all other peoples abandon their particular customs. So not only would there be one law that would be common to everyone, but individual peoples had to give up their own particular customs. All the Gentiles conformed to the command of the king. And many Israelites delighted in his religion, and they sacrificed to idols and they profaned the Sabbath. What is it saying? When Antiochus issued this order that everybody should have one religion, the polytheistic religions of the world didn't care. So, all right, we'll add something more. They all were delighted to add these new restrictions. And even many Jews who were getting tired of being particular and singled out and being marked off from the other peoples round about them. Even some of these Jews decided to follow these laws, and they decided to sacrifice to idols, and they profaned the Sabbath. The king sent letters by messenger to Jerusalem and to the cities of Judah, ordering them to follow the foreign custom in their land, to prohibit burnt offering sacrifices and libations in their holy places, but rather to profane the Sabbath and the feast days, to desecrate the sanctuary and the sacred ministers, meaning the priests, to build pagan altars and temples and shrines, to sacrifice swine and unclean animals upon them, to leave their sons uncircumcised, and to defile themselves with every kind of impurity and abomination, so that they might forget the law and change all of its ordinances. Whoever refused to act according to the command of the king was to be put to death. In words such as these, he wrote to his whole kingdom. He appointed inspectors over all the people, and he ordered the cities of Judah to offer sacrifices in each and every city unto him. Many of the people, those who had abandoned the law, I mean those Jews who were faithless, joined them and committed evil in the land. They drove Israel, and because of this drove Israel into hiding wherever places of refuge could be found. On the 15th day of the month of Kislev in the year 145, the king erected the desolating abomination upon the altar of burnt offerings, and in the surrounding cities of Judah, he built pagan idols, which means the king took the temple of Jerusalem, replaced the altar to God with a special altar for these pagan sacrifices, and then he proceeded to build foreign altars in all of the different cities and towns of Judah. They also burnt incense at the doors of houses and in the streets, and scrolls, any scroll of the law that they found, they tore up and burnt. Whoever was found with a scroll of the covenant, meaning a Torah, and whoever observed the law was condemned to death by royal decree. So the Assyrian Greeks, the foreign power, used its power against Israel, against those who were caught each and every month in the cities. On the 20th day of each month, the pagan altars were placed in each of the Judean cities. In keeping with the decree, they put to death women who had their children circumcised, and they hung their babies from their necks, which means after they slaughtered the babies and the women, they hung the babies from their necks. Their families also and those who circumcised them were killed. But many in Israel were determined and resolved in their hearts not to eat anything unclean. They preferred rather to die, rather to be defiled, they preferred to die rather to be defiled with food or profane the holy covenant, and they did die. And great wrath came upon Israel. And I'm going to stop the share. Different account, right? Different story. No talk about a cruse of oil that miraculously burnt for 8 days. No story about the miracle of Hanukkah being the miracle of God who caused the lights in the menorah in the temple to burn for 8 days. Instead, we have the miracle of Jewish survival in the face of what I have read to you and what I will send you. These terrible, terrible persecutions, and I cut them down. It goes on and on. But in the face of all of these terrible events that occurred in the land of Palestine to the Jewish community because of Antiochus and his edicts, his laws, because there were Jews who were not going to violate the laws of their ancestors, even on the point of death, there built up a head of steam that led to an open revolt, a break that led to the Maccabean revolt. And the story that you have probably heard is this revolt did not begin in Jerusalem, because as I think I've already mentioned to you, Jerusalem, the priests in the temple were already sympathizers with the Assyrian Greeks. This revolt took place outside of Jerusalem in the Jewish areas of Judea, in the city of Modi'in, and it was led by a group of individuals, families who decided to rise up and defy the laws of the Assyrian Greeks. The result was the battle ensued, which lasted for a period of 2 to 3 years. At the end of that period of time, not only had the Assyrian forces been forced to withdraw from the area, but the Jews, miracle of miracles, had succeeded in taking the city of Jerusalem, destroying all the heathen objects that were in the temple, all of the heathen altars and all of the profanations that were there. They cleansed the temple of it, and they rededicated the temple to the worship of the one God. The miracle was not that oil burnt for 8 days. The miracle was that against overwhelming odds that they should not have been able to have survived, miracle of miracles, the Jewish people not only lasted, they actually drove out an enemy that was stronger than them and finally forced that enemy to sue for peace. Now, I'm going to ask you to choose which miracle story you like the best. If you like the oil that burnt miraculously for 8 days, then stay with that. And maybe they're both true, I don't know. If you choose to believe that the miracle was not that a small amount of oil managed to burn an incredibly long time, but a small, insignificant people managed to last against incredible odds for not just 8 days, but for 3 years, and to finally succeed in driving the enemy out. If you think the miracle of Hanukkah is the miracle that a people who are committed to God and to God's law can defy enemies that are far stronger than them and can turn the tides on them and can lead the first rebellion in the history of humanity for religious freedom, because that's what Hanukkah was, that was the significance of Hanukkah. It was the first time that people went to war in order to preserve their right to worship their God in their own particular way. It could only have happened to the Jews because it was only the Jews who refused to recognize all other forms of worship except the worship that had been passed down from God to Moses in the Torah. The Jews were the only people who said, not our way, along with other ways, it's our way and only our way. No other way will be acceptable. We will not accept any compromises. We will not accept any halfway measures. We are prepared to give up everything, including our lives, including the lives of our children, to fulfill the laws of the Torah, to keep kosher, to circumcise our children, to teach the Torah, to observe rites in the temple. We are going to refuse to violate Jewish law because the God of Israel is a greater authority to us than the nations of the earth. And that, Craig, was the origin of the holiday of Hanukkah. Now, I maintain that miracle is just as big as the miracle of the oil lasting for 8 days. And once you understand, Craig, that the reason for Hanukkah was because if the Jews had succumbed, if the Jews had fallen, if Antiochus had been successful, and he had wiped out Judaism in the year 165 or so BCE, there would have been no Judaism, there would have been no Christianity, there would have been no Islam, there may not have even been Western religion. When they were fighting for their own religion, but by fighting and preserving their religion intact, by refusing to compromise, the Jews made it possible for Western religion, for the belief in one God, universal moral God, to persist. That is the miracle of Hanukkah. That is the miracle of Jewish history, by the way, as well. At the end of this long story of Jews being defeated by one kingdom after another, the lesson we learn is when Jews feel that their backs are to the fire, when they feel that the enemy is all around them and there is no way they can survive any longer by being divided, when they come together and say, we'll unite as a people and we will survive together or we will perish together, then the Jewish people are able to do incredible, even I would say miraculous things. And that is the story of the Hasmoneans. To finish the story off, the Hasmonean kingdom survives. There are 5 brothers who, besides the father of Mattathias, one after another, the brothers die. But even after Judah and 2 of the other brothers die, the last 2 brothers, Shimon and Yonatan, live. They become kings in Israel. They become heads and leaders in Israel. And they pass on for the next 100 years, from the year about 145 to the year 38 or 39 BCE. They pass on without interruption a kingdom of Hasmonean priests and a kingdom of Israelite kings that continue on for 100 years. All right, I'm going to stop here. Craig, did I answer your question, Craig Sturden? I don't know if I did or not. I hope I did. Okay. All right.
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Craig. Okay, so that's why Hanukkah, Craig. It is make it not because it's a biblical holiday, not because it's the story of the Jewish people. If I had to say, if there was one holiday that depicts the tenacity, the stubbornness, the hard-heartedness, the perseverance of the Jewish people, the holiday I would pick would be Hanukkah. There are other holidays that are more central, but Hanukkah celebrates the heroism and the strength of the Jewish people. We celebrate not so much God on Hanukkah, we celebrate the strength of the Jewish people. All right, a little under 1 hour. Anybody have any questions about anything we've talked about this evening? Go ahead, Larry.
So how does it come out for 8 days?
All right, so here is the true, you want to know the true answer was?
I want to know your answer.
And I'll tell you the true answer. It's a good question. How did it ever come about to be 8 days? Okay. If you go back, Larry, to the book of Kings, you will see that when King Solomon first dedicated the temple, the first temple in Jerusalem, you know how long the festivities lasted?
8 days.
8 days. So when the Maccabees rededicated the temple, okay, what would be more natural than them to say, just as the temple was dedicated when it was built by Solomon, and the dedication took place, the celebration took place over 8 days, now that we have repurified the temple, we have conquered our enemies, and we have reestablished the faith of Israel as our faith, what more appropriate way of celebrating it than 8 days like the establishment of the first temple? And that's why 8, Larry, because it mirrors the dedication of the first temple. It's not coincidental. And 8 wasn't just pulled out from nowhere. It wasn't based on any other Jewish holidays. It was based on the fact that the first temple, go to the book of Kings, and you see how Solomon celebrated. And he celebrated for 8 days. And on the 8th and final day, he dismisses the people of Israel to return because it took 8 days, longer than a full week. I mean, longer than 7 days. Took 8 days to celebrate the consecration of the temple. By the way, I don't know if it's related or not, Larry, but to celebrate the dedication of a Jewish boy, you know how many days you have to wait? 8.
8?
8 days. Why does the Torah say you should circumcise on the 8th day? Where does this 8th come from? Well, it doesn't tell you why. God says the 8th day, because only after 8 days, that is the period you to mark dedication. When a child is lived for this 8th day, that's the day you dedicate it through the act of circumcision. So this is not haphazard. This is not coincidental. This is not someone pulled this up out of the air. This is very deliberate. 8 became a symbol, not of God, of humanity. God creates the world, Larry, on 7 days, and then on the 8th day, he turns it over to human beings. God's part of the story is the first 7 days. Our part of the story, Larry, starts on day number 8. That's where we've come in, okay? Day number 8. The story of Jewish history is a story about God. Believe me, I am traditional. If it had not been for the fact that there was a God in Israel, a God among the Jewish people, we would have not made it. We would have been gone a long time ago. But I can only give most of the credit to God. The other part of the credit I give to the Jewish people. God could be whatever he wanted, but he gave human beings free choice. And when he gave us free choice, he gave us the opportunity to either follow his commandments or not. For the Jewish people, for most of our history, the price of following God's commandments has been very steep. The price of following God's commandments has often been, like it was in the story of Hanukkah, death, martyrdom, persecution, suffering. If the Jewish people kept the Torah, and thus God watched over them, it was because the Jewish people watched over God's Torah and their covenant. So this is all tied together. In the end, I'm telling you, we started out by talking about God, and God is the beginning of our story. But the story of Jewish history, its continuing survival, is a joint story. It is a dialogue between the God of heaven and the Jewish people. It is not a one-way story. If we did not fulfill our part of the covenant, God would not have been able to fulfill his part of the covenant. And if God had not been able to count on us to do what he commanded and to follow his laws, we stiff-necked people, this drama of Jewish history would have ended long, long ago. Anybody else? Go ahead, Jerry.
I had two comments, observations. One will be a throwback to Alexander, but first continuing on this thought of the Maccabees. So I remember when I first read some of the Maccabees, I was puzzled as to how the grandfather Maccabee got the drop and dispatched the guard and the treasonous traitor Jew,
Mhm.
because he was fairly aged. But apparently he was, what, got to the sword first or something? Do you know any more details on that?
Actually, it's an interesting story, Jerry. Actually, the father of the 5 Maccabee children, there were 5 brothers. There were 6 members of the family. I don't know how many women there were. There was a father and his 5 sons. The father's name was Mattathiyahu or Mattathias. He had 5 sons. Of the 5 sons, okay, every single one of them was committed to the struggle that the father was committed to. The father also participated in the struggle. As a matter of fact, this is a story that starts a struggle. When the Assyrian Greek officers of Antiochus came to the small Judean village of Modi'in, which is located not far from Jerusalem, they set up a pagan idol in the center of the town, as they did with most Judean towns, and they assembled all the Jews of the town to gather together. And then, addressing all the Jews who were in the marketplace or in the town square, in the town center, the officers of Antiochus made the following declaration. By order of Antiochus IV, the king of the, you are now required to pay honor and allegiance to Antiochus by sacrificing up offerings upon the altar we have established outside of Jerusalem, and the animals that were chosen for sacrifice were specifically chosen to be abominated, were chosen to be swine. Invariably, when these officers went to city after city, even if the people were not inclined, Jerry, to obey the Lord order right away, after the Greeks, Syrians had killed 3 or 4 or 5 of them and made an example of them by martyring them, then everybody else fell in line, and pretty much, rather than facing death, they did what they had to do. In the village of Modi'in, you're right, Jerry, in the village of Modi'in, when they made this statement, we now call upon all the Jews in this town to come forward and to offer up offerings. And the priests were usually the ones who were called upon to do it. Mattathias was a priest. He and his sons wouldn't do it. Another Jew sets out, the story is told in the book of Maccabees, another Jew sets out, goes up to the altar, preparing to make the offering of the swine, the pork, on the altar. And as he is lifting up his hands to offer the offering, Mattathias jumps forward, strikes him with his cane, not only knocks him unconscious, but also knocks down the Greek official who is standing by the altar to monitor things. And then he cries out, "All who are for the Lord, let them follow me." And he and his sons and the people of Modi'in rise up in a mass demonstration. And finally, the dike breaks, and they leave. They overpower the Greek guards that are there, and they begin the rebellious struggle that will last for a number of years, but 3 years in its initial phases. They begin the revolt against the Greek Assyrian Empire. Mattathias began it. Mattathias was an old man when it started. He dies relatively soon. He leaves it to his sons. And by the way, this rebellion will continue until it is finally completed and the final vestiges are wiped out. It's almost 2 decades. But by the end of that 2 decades, Mattathias is dead. 3 of his 5 sons are dead, but 2 of them will go on to actually rule as kings and high priests in Israel. So what was begun by the old man, the fanatic, the religious fanatic Mattathias, was continued by his sons to culmination, to success. That's the miracle of Hanukkah. Okay. Yes, go ahead, Larry. Did you?
A second one was regarding Alexander the Great. I guess some scholars believe that some of the Jews, the scribes, showed Alexander Great in the Bible regarding Cyrus the Persian and the March of World Powers.
Mm-hmm.
I had read something that Josephus had written about that.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you something, Jerry, that I think is true. All conquerors begin magnanimous, and later on their empires turn to be tyrannical. When Alexander conquered the Middle East, he conquered a lot of countries. He conquered almost all the Middle East, from Egypt all the way to almost India. It was a big territory. So he began his rule relatively well-intentioned toward the people. So he allowed each of the people to continue to monitor their own affairs so long as they recognized that Alexander was the power in the area. Alexander was very magnanimous, not only to the Jews, but to many other people. He said, look, I'm not going, so long as you recognize we're the conquering power and you pay your duty, your tributes, whatever to us, you go ahead and live your life. We're not going to tell you how to do it. But as time went on and as others followed him, they became more and more dictatorial, more and more, what's the word I'm looking for? Intolerant of any kind of variation. Alexander began relatively tolerant, as most beginning rulers do. But the people who followed him over that period of 200 years became less and less tolerant. Okay, I hope this has been of some interest to all of you. I will send out the notes and everything and the readings that I have given you. Should you want to check me, there are two ways you can check me. I gave you the citation in the Talmud, so if any of you want to Google Talmud, Shabbat 21b, you can read the story we've just read and you'll have a copy of it. And if any of you want to check the story we read together on the first book of Maccabees, just go on your computers, Google First Book of Maccabees, chapter 1, and you can read the exact thing I just read to you. Two very different accounts, one describing a military miracle that no one could imagine, the second describing a spiritual miracle. Why? Because as Jewish history goes on, and the rabbis lived during a period of persecution, they downplay the military miracle and they emphasize the spiritual. Why? Because after the defeat of the Jewish people by Rome, there was very little chance of military force winning the Jewish people anything. The truth of the matter is that after Israel is defeated by the Romans in the year 70 and goes into exile and is dispersed across the land, there was no more any hope of a military victory. The victory of the Maccabees was never going to be repeated, at least not until modern times in modern Israel. The only victory that the Jews could look to throughout the close to 1900 years of their exile was a spiritual miracle. That's why the rabbis played up the oil, the miracle of God. They played up the spiritual miracle and they downplayed the military miracle. Okay? Thank you all for being here.
But the spiritual wouldn't have taken place without the military.
The miracle would never have occurred without the military. There would have been no temple to purify and no oil to last for 8 days.
Right.
Yes, like in so many other cases, Larry, the more common sense answer, the military, the unbelievable victory of a people against all odds, that is really the origin of the spiritual story of the survival of the Jewish people.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Thank you all. Thank you. And have a very good, don't tune in next week. I'm going to be in Chicago. So everybody enjoy yourselves. And I'll get back to you as to more material.
Have a safe trip.
Have a safe trip, Rabbi.
Thank you. Leslie,
Randy.
question?
What's next?
What's next? Well, I barely got us through ancient Jewish history. I didn't quite do that. So assuming that we continue on with this course, we will end with the ancient period with the story of the Roman persecution, which marks the beginning of the 1900-year exile of the Jewish people. The Jewish people were in their land for a long time, but they were out of their land, Leslie, for far longer. And the next part of Jewish history talks about Jews dispersed, found in every corner of the world, relatively powerless, without a country of their own, without a language of their own that they necessarily shared day by day, without customs of their own, because they were so dispersed. They managed to live for 1900 years through a miracle. Yes, James, go ahead.
When did the Palestinians move into the land of Israel after the Jews were left after the Romans took over? Because they lay claim to the land because they said they were there before us. So I'm wondering when that started.
You want the actual answer? And I'm prepared to defend this. They moved into the area the beginning of the 1900s when Israel began, when the Jews began to develop the land of Israel. There were no,
Was that
there
or
were
that
no,
recent?
yes, there were Arabs who lived in the land. They did not call themselves Palestinians. There were Arabs who lived in the land before that. But if you say to me, when did the Palestinians as a identifiable group, a group that identified the land as being theirs and Palestinian, not till into the 1910, 1915, 1920. Before that time, the Arabs who lived in Palestine did not call themselves Palestinians. They called themselves Syrians. They called themselves Arabs. They were part of one undivided, united Arab nation, which included all the Arabs of the world, but there was no Palestine prior to 19, I would say.
Okay, because both the Palestinians and the Arabs say it's their land. So then how long were the Arabs there before? I mean, when did they get there?
Okay, so I can give you exact dates on that. The Arabs do not enter the area that we call Palestine, James, until the year 640 CE, approximately 640, maybe a few years earlier than that. For the next period of 1,300 years, the land of the Middle East continues to be Muslim in population, with the exception of the Crusader period. For a period of 200 years, the Christians retake the land of Palestine. So I would say for about 1,100 years, the Muslims are the ones in charge in Palestine.
Temperature, but not quite that.
Oh, so is that how they justified that as their land over
Yes.
ours? They were there.
Yes,
I
yes.
mean, I don't know whose land it is based on that.
Well, first of all, they can't claim to be the indigenous people because the original people in the land were not Palestinians, nor were they Arabs. They were Semitic Canaanite tribes. They cannot claim a right to the land based on continual settlement. Hold on just a second. Okay. They cannot claim the right to continual settlement because the truth is they didn't settle there continuously, and Jews have always lived in the land of Israel from ancient times till today. They cannot even claim the right of modern nationhood based on law because in 1948, the United Nations, then representing the world community, James, declared that there would be two states created in the area, a Jewish state and an Arab state. So by virtue of being among the original inhabitants of the land, one of the people who continue to live in the land the longest, based on the fact that the land of Israel was the center of the Jewish people and the Jewish Bible, based on the recognition of many other religions, including Christianity and Islam, that Israel was originally connected with the Jewish people. The Druze have, on many different counts, a higher claim to connection with the land of Israel than any other people in the world. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. So then are they not aware of what you just said then? Because
they are aware of it, but doesn't mean that people believe it. You can change anything. I told you that in the Bible, it says that Abraham's son Isaac continued the tradition. If you read the Quran, Abraham's tradition was not continued by Isaac, it was continued by Ishmael. So in a document that was written 630 years after the turn of the Common Era, they changed the story. They changed it around. No longer
Ishmael's the Muslim son that was exiled with the first wife, right? I mean the slave, right?
That is correct. Ishmael was the son of Hagar, and according to the Quran, the promise made to Abraham to give him and his descendants the land of Israel in perpetuity forever, so long as they were faithful to God's covenant, that promise was not made to Abraham through Isaac, it was made to Abraham through Ishmael. Okay, that is how the Quran rewrites the story. Trust me on this. I will willing to debate any Muslim scholar who wants to debate it. If you read the Hebrew scriptures, there is no question that the tradition was given through Abraham to Isaac, and to Isaac to Jacob, and to the Jewish people. The rewriting of history takes place in the time of Islam at the beginning of the 7th century.
Okay. I don't think most Jews know that, but they should.
Most Jews don't know that, and which is why they don't have an answer to the question.
Yeah, I didn't have an answer until 30 seconds ago.
Okay, well, maybe you've suggested to me another thing, way to go from here. Okay.
Yeah, teach the Muslims this class.
Yeah, teach them. Yeah. I don't think I'd have as many screens if I were teaching Muslims in this class, but we'll see. Good night, everybody.
Good night, Rabbi Rob. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Enjoy your
Oh,
trip.
thank you all.
Yeah, safe travels.
Thank you.
Is he gonna be out for what are we?